The previous lecture was about the typology of cultures. Culture is understood as an information algorithmic system, that is, it is purpose consonant in relation to a certain set of objectives and carries in itself ways and methods, i.e. algorithmics, for the achievement of objectives. Cultures differ in their sets of objectives, ways and methods. In addition, culture is all that information and algorithmics which is not passed from generation to generation on the basis of the genetic mechanism of the biological species. Instincts and unconditioned reflexes are also an algorithmic support, but they are transferred on the basis of genetics. Culture is passed on apart from the genetic mechanism, but nevertheless, man's genetics carries in itself a certain potential for the development of culture. Therefore, when we analyze cultures, the main thing is to correctly build a typology, because if we focus on cuisines in cultures, what clothes are accepted as national and where, why these clothes are accepted as national, then we lose the most important thing. All cultures are characterized by three fundamental attributes. The first attribute is the relation towards the creative potential of a person. There are such cultures that are indifferent, that is, if you want to master and develop your creative potential, you do it. If you want to ruin it, you do it. No one will say anything, this is your own personal business. There are such cultures that are oriented on ensuring that the creative potential of a person is mastered and developed, including in the continuity of generations. Where creative potential is mastered and developed, there can also be variations. Because there can be cultures where the creative potential has to be mastered in some social groups, and in other social groups it has to be suppressed, in order to create a system of dependence of the majority that has not mastered their creative potential on a certain minority that has mastered their creative potential and use it at their own discretion as they see fit. Everyone already knows the plot of the tale Tops and Roots. The bear in this case acts as a subject who has not mastered his creative potential, and the man, generally speaking, has some kind of creativity, as a result of which the bear owes him, and the bear will never be free. Societies differ in how their cultures relate to creative potential. Further on, creative potential by default presupposes a certain initiative. An initiative always presupposes a certain will. Will is the ability of a person to subordinate himself and the flow of events around to the apperceived by him purpose orientation. Will, in this case, always acts from the level of consciousness in the psyche of man, because unconscious automatisms and something else unconscious act from the unconscious levels. So, will always acts from the level of consciousness. And if there is no apperceived purpose orientation, then will has no reason for activity, because further on the following principle works. If one does not know to which port one is sailing, no wind is favorable. That is, what to do and how to do it. If you have not decided on objectives, this is an impossible question, and then will cannot be implemented. The third factor is the question on the correlation of creative potential and shame and sovest. Because creative potential as such, not limited by any nravious ethical norms, is destructive. And culture should be built in such a way that firstly the creative potential of the entire society is mastered and developed. First of all, this concerns the younger generations, so that the will of the child is not suppressed, because will is the only one that is given to a person, so that in adolescence he does not fall prey to awakened instincts, sexual instincts, instincts of herd pack behavior. Therefore, the worst thing that parents can achieve from a child is unconditional obedience. In this case, will does not develop. Then, when the child enters adolescence, the instincts of sexual and herd pack behavior come into play. The result is depravity under the impact of sexual instincts, and under the impact of herd pack instincts, the most severe juvenile delinquency, which has no meaning other than showing off in front of one another, and the result is serious crimes. Well, if there is no will, then degradation is ensured, and it turns out that there appears a subject who in some cases can be manipulated if there is a need for it. And the third attribute is the relation towards shame and sovest. If one asks the question in an audience, when was the last time you blushed with shame? Then usually people fall into deep thoughtfulness, although no nimbus shines over any of them. That is, no nimbus, and no prick of souvest or shame either. These are the three attributes that determine the quality of the life of society: creative potential, mastery of it, the will of people, and souvest, to which both the will and the creative potential of a person has to be subordinated. This is a summary of the previous lecture. Therefore, logically, today's meeting is dedicated to creative potential, because if it exists, then one can also find will. One can also find souvest if they are lost somewhere. And if there is no creative potential and a person does not master it, then he factually is not a human, but just a walking humanoid, stuffed with who knows what products of culture. Moving on, you, after all, need to understand that the physiology of metabolism and the biochemistry of the organism of man do not have the information capacity and the performance speed necessary in order to carry the psyche as a process. The psyche as a process is carried by man's biofield. We live, unfortunately, in a culture where many people who hear the word biofield immediately begin to suspect that you have fallen into some kind of madness, that you are a charlatan, and so on. But let's look from the standpoint of physics. If an electron jumps from orbit to orbit, what happens? A quantum of energy is emitted. Atoms gather into molecules. In the molecule, the atoms have some degrees of freedom, and according to these degrees of freedom, they oscillate. That is, there are no stuck molecules in nature. If the molecules oscillate, what happens? They emit something. A structure, let's say a cell, forms from molecules. A cell consists of elements that emit something, and it itself also emits something that the elements from which the cell forms separately could not emit. Further, we get an organism, and the organism also emits something. What the organism emits is called a biofield. Therefore, when someone states that a biofield does not exist, then this is schizophrenia, because he studied physics at school and should know that there are no atoms that do not emit anything. If atoms emit something, then the biofield has to exist. Moreover, this is not a specific field, it is a complex set of physical fields that the organism of the person emits. But other living organisms also emit biofields. Yes, they have specificity. And if we now consider this audience at the level of substance and interactions of substance, we mechanically do not interact directly. None of you is touching my body. I am not touching anything. I am emitting in the acoustic range. You are perceiving the acoustic emissions. If we turn to the consideration of the field component of the interaction, then we do not see the aura. But if we nevertheless use equipment that allows one to visualize the aura, then we will see that many seemingly isolated organisms are connected by certain biofield structures. And if they are connected by biofield structures, then there occurs an exchange of energy, an exchange of information, certain algorithmics, and we generate a collective psyche. What does this have to do with creative potential? This has to do with it directly. Because when the time comes and you become parents, at the age when the child masters articulate speech, he will bombard you with many questions, and the questions will be such that the Academy of Sciences of all countries could be provided with work for several decades ahead. Your child comes up to you and poses a question. What could come next? So here there are a few variants. First, leave me alone, you will know when you grow up. Variant 2, you strain yourself on the theme of what you were taught at school or university concerning this question and give detailed answers. Variant 3, you put your child on your lap and start reasoning with him on the theme that interests him. Which variant is right? The third one. Why is it right? Because it develops your child's creative potential. But here you need to understand the physiology of the question. Because if you work in the mode of giving information from your memory, then you have one dynamics of biofield. If you reason, that is, your intellect and not only your memory works, then you have a different dynamics of biofield, and accordingly, your aura abides in a different mode. If your child is sitting on your lap, then he abides in your biofield, and by virtue of the age and size of his organism, your biofield is likely more powerful than the biofield of your child. If you are not an enemy to the child from his point of view, then he has no need to isolate himself from you at the biofield level. That is, he is situated in your biofield. And when you reason, his biofield attunes to your biofield and enters into the mode in which his intellect works. In the first two variants, the mode in which the intellect works is not available for the child. He has to either find it himself or copy from someone, from another adult, not from you, his dad and mom. But if he copies it from another adult, then this other adult may turn out to be a more significant and closer person in his life than you yourselves. To put it differently, the question on creative potential has its origins in early childhood. In the aspect of preparation for the speech period, creative potential actually has foundations in the prenatal period, when you, an expectant mother, will carry your child. Starting from a certain level of development, the fetus perceives information flows through the mother's organism, and depending on what the mother listens to, watches, what her biofield state is like, preparations for life outside the mother's organism are underway. And then at the next stage, when the child masters articulate speech and begins to communicate with people on his own initiative, then the nature of communication with you, with other adults, determines a lot, whether his creative potential will be mastered or not. What's more, the biofield component, the ability to create the right mood corresponding to work, this is truly very significant. And it will be better if your child comes to school or kindergarten with this skill, even if on the unconscious level. But it is never too late, including in an adult state, to feel your biofield, different modes of its functioning, to learn how to freely move from one state to another. At least at the school age, a child can do it. In the final grade, students had problems with stereometry, solid geometry in space. For most, it was a nightmare. So, in order to solve tasks in stereometry, the right and left hemispheres have to work in concert. The right one is responsible for images, and the left one is responsible for logics, including the logic of converting a spatial task into a set of plane ones when the plane Euclidean geometry begins to work. If this is not the case, then tasks in stereometry are not solved. If you are able to solve tasks in stereometry, then this means that your right and left hemispheres work more or less normally, in concert. If a person who has problems with stereometry enters into communication with you, and you are sitting together, and you are watching how he is solving the tasks, then he is solving the tasks in your biofield. If he does not perceive you as an enemy from whom he needs to isolate himself, then his biofield will also attune to yours. Further on, you only need to explain in a while why, in your presence, a stereometry task is solved in 10 minutes, and in your absence the same task cannot be solved within 2 hours. After the skill of creating a mood is developed, tasks on stereometry and all other tasks are solved easily. Stereometry, by and large, is one of the tests for full matureness of intellect, the full matureness of personal culture of intellectual activity. Because if this works and is solved, then tasks of both humanitarian sciences and natural sciences are solved. And if one has problems with mathematics, and problems of precisely this kind, where the right and left hemispheres work non-concordantly, then errors are possible in humanitarian sciences and natural sciences, very terrible errors, simply by strength of the fact that the intellect works not in proper order. It is not fully fledged. We already live in a culture that has been developing, well, according to different estimates, according to official science, around 2,000 years, according to unofficial science, around 13,000 years, since the moment of the geophysical catastrophe that destroyed the previous civilization, and as a result of which, Antarctica ended up in the polar zone. In Siberia there appeared permafrost, with freshly frozen mammoths and much more. In our culture there is such an educational discipline, philosophy. There is a branch in philosophy, Gnosiology, which from Greek means teaching about knowledge, that is, how new knowledge is worked out. Logically, if you do a course in philosophy in which there is Gnosiology, Then, having read a course based on some kind of personal culture of intellectual activity, you can correlate what you have read with what is happening in your psyche, see some glitches in your psyche, work a little on this, and after that everything will fall back into its place. Next, there are unpleasant things related to the fact that the overwhelming majority of officials and deputies of all levels took a course in philosophy at universities, someone in a traineeship. The questions of gnosiology were touched upon, and accordingly, if not all of them were total failures, then their cognitive creative culture should be good, well, more or less good, and accordingly, if their cognitive creative culture is more or less good, then everything in life should also be more or less good, and there can be no economic or other crises in the country, because those who are in power should see from where and how problems arise, and correspondingly work out measures to suppress generators of problems, eradicate them. And as a result, life, developing as if by itself, should become from year to year better, more joyful, happier. Old, solved problems should go into the past, and there should open up possibilities for people to finally start solving some other problems, which we now cannot even envision. Our imagination is not enough for this, and in the end there should be a different, much better quality of life for the civilization as a whole. Does this approach have the right to exist? Well, what do you remember from philosophy, gnosiology? What are the explanations for the silence? There are three variants. We studied so badly that we do not remember anything, or we are so feeble-minded that we could not understand anything, and the third variant, the courses are such that there is nothing to understand there. This is simply demagogy on peri-philosophical cognitive themes. If the right and left hemispheres work in concert, then it's impossible to correlate any base of images with the words in these courses. In the history of philosophy, you can learn a lot of cognitive and useful things for yourself if you do not swat biographies but try to understand what thoughts the philosophers of the past came to. The study of philosophy in the Soviet Union and in the post-Soviet Russia is characterized by the fact that the history of philosophy in Russia itself is almost completely passed over in silence. If one of the domestic philosophers is mentioned, then those people are mainly mentioned who had a pro-Western way of thinking. But those who were skeptical about Western philosophy, they are passed over in silence. One of these is Alexei Stepanovich Khomyakov, born in 1804. He was a poet, one of the ideologists of Slavophilism, in terms of qualification, a corresponding member of the Imperial Academy of Sciences in philosophy. Was there mention of him in the philosophy course? No, there was not. And why did the compilers of the course not devote even a paragraph to Khomyakov? Khomyakov has an article named The Opinion of Russians About Foreigners. In the article he writes, Hegel, in his brilliant phenomenology, reached the extreme limit reachable by philosophy along the path it chooses. It has reached its own self-destruction. The conclusion was simple and clear. Merit is immortal. And behind all this, his strict logical mind did not understand his own conclusion. To be without philosophy, to abandon the covenant of so many centuries, keep your own, i.e. Neo-German life, without any content. It was impossible. Hegel, in involuntary self-deception, created a colossal spectre of his logic, testifying to the greatness of his genius by the greatness of his mistake. Now is it clear why Khomyakov is not in the educational courses? Because if this is written in a textbook, then the questions arise. Where was Hegel wrong from the point of view of Khomyakov? And which one is right in life, Hegel or Khomyakov? Western philosophical tradition? Or is it necessary to develop some other philosophical tradition? In the same article, The Opinion of Russians About Foreigners, Khomyakov writes the following. That inner consciousness, which is much wider than logical consciousness, and which makes up the personality of every person in the same way as any other people, has been lost by us. However, the tight-knit logical consciousness of the life of our people is also inaccessible to us for many reasons. In accordance with our proud contempt for this life, in accordance with the inability of a purely rational educatedness to understand living phenomena, and in accordance even with the absence of data It could undergo analytical decomposition. I do not say that these data were not, but that they are all such, that they cannot be understood by the mind brought up by foreign thought and chained in foreign systems that have nothing to do with the beginnings of our ancient spiritual life and our ancient enlightenment. If you translate this from the language of that era into modern language, then what is this about? This is about the fact that man's psyche is two-leveled. We think, for the most part, at the level of consciousness in lexicon. As the studies carried out already after Chomyakov showed, the performance speed of consciousness is 15 bits per second, and a maximum of 8 to 12 objects are simultaneously held. And that inner consciousness, which is much broader than the logical one, in the modern language is called the unconscious levels of the psyche. And they, as systems of processing of information, are manifoldly more powerful than the level of consciousness of the psyche. And Chomyakov reproaches, in essence, Western philosophy for focusing on the level of consciousness, on the logics of the level of consciousness. And thus, Western philosophy excluded from the process of intellectual activity the main intellectual power of man, hidden in the unconscious levels of his psyche. If the study of philosophy leads to this, then further the question is natural to fellow philosophers who themselves philosophize and teach philosophy to students. Well, what about your gnosiological culture? Is it in Hegel's style, or is it free from the shackles of logics? Unfortunately, the vast majority will not try to answer this question, but to get away from it. And in fact, the tradition is such that everyone rushes to defend Hegel. But if you rush to defend Hegel, then you have to understand that Hitlerism is a consequence of Hegel's philosophy, its impact on German culture. Hegel's philosophy was transformed into the dialectical materialism of Marxism-Leninism. In the Soviet Union, problems arose in connection with the fact that the philosophy of Marxism-Leninism was not able to discern problems in a timely manner and provide methods and ways to solve them. When they talk about philosophy, some insist on its extreme importance for the formation of personality. Meanwhile, others say that since philosophy cannot solve any specific task, then why is it needed? But, nevertheless, it has existed for millennia, and it is not discarded as a worthless element of culture. And people expect something from philosophy. But what do they expect? The following metaphor helps to understand the correct role of philosophy. Do you know what a tuning fork is? This is such a steel thing. You knock on it, and it emits the sound of La on the first octave. Why La of the first octave and not Do? Look, this is one ear. Here is a head, here is the other ear. Then here are the cochlears. Here is the distance between the cochlears. And this is La of the first octave. 1/4 of the acoustic wavelength of La corresponds to the distance between the auditory receptors of the average person. Therefore, the tuning fork is precisely La, not Do or something else. If there is a tuning fork, then even the simplest melody cannot be played on a tuning fork. The melody of Chizik Pizik cannot be played on a tuning fork, although it is considered to be one of the simplest melodies. And then everything turns out to be simple. If a person has perfect pitch, then he does not need a tuning fork. And if a person does not have perfect pitch, but he wants to play in an orchestra, then he tunes his violin either according to the violin of the one who has perfect pitch, or according to the tuning fork. And so the tuning fork solves the task of tuning the orchestra to be able to play the music correctly. And if the tuning fork is out of tune, it does not set the note of La, but some other note, what will happen? Can one tune the orchestra? In this case, one will tune the orchestra according to this tuning fork, but the orchestra will be tuned some tones lower or higher. What comes next? The melody will be correct too, and played cleanly. But there will be something different. If the composer has produced music that must fall into a certain frequency range, then his music, like a flow of vibrations, will resonate with those structures that carry their own frequencies, those that are needed. If the music is up or down the stave, then it will affect other systems. It will affect a different set of its own frequencies and will resonate. That is, this is the equivalent to you addressing Petya, Petya not hearing you, and Lena responding. And if there are several tuning forks in the orchestra, and they are all different, what will happen? In this case, the orchestra falls apart. Philosophy in the culture of society is similar to a tuning fork, and it is a kind of analog of a tuning fork. If philosophy is adequate, then the whole orchestra of particular scientific disciplines can be tuned in accordance with it, and they, in concert, will provide the needs of humanity, mutually supplementing each other without conflicts. If you personally have a sense of measure and a good, quite effective personal cognitive creative culture, then you don't need philosophy just as a person with perfect pitch does not need a tuning fork. But if your sense of measure is not very good, and your personal cognitive creative culture is somewhat different than you would like, then in this case, if you are faced with the right philosophy, you can attune your sense of measure according to it, as though according to a tuning fork, and bring your intellect into a more or less effective state in accordance with the philosophy that you are mastering. If everything is fine with philosophy in society, then all particular applied sciences can really work in concert and provide a solution to these problems that put pressure on society without creating new problems. But if philosophy is out of tune, then there is a discord in the orchestra, and the impact of particular scientific disciplines on life will be accompanied by the emergence of all sorts of unexpected problems, and the concomitant effects may be such that they devalue the seemingly good result. Therefore, the question of philosophy is truly a very important question in life, because it turns out like this. You enter into some kind of branch of activity, for example, engineering. There are techniques for designing anything. If you turn to libraries, then you can find the techniques of designing a steam locomotive so that your steam locomotive is a good steam locomotive. Where do design techniques come from? Design techniques for anything are from design philosophy. That is, from the question on how to get a finished product so that it fits correctly into the technosphere, interacts correctly with the environment and people, and at the same time does not contain any internal problems. This is, generally speaking, the task of design philosophy. And again, pay attention. Design philosophy as an academic discipline, in the overwhelming majority of cases, is absent, or it is somehow merged with the corresponding courses in designing something. It is invisibly present in them. What does this lead to? Let's say you decide to design a gas turbine engine. Then it turns out that if you are designing an engine with a capacity of 1,000 horsepower, then first of all you must solve the tasks of reliability and thermodynamics, and only after you have solved these tasks will you be able to solve the tasks of hydrodynamics, that is, the configuration of the flow of paths. And if you are designing a car with a capacity of more than 10,000 horsepower, then first of all you must solve the tasks of hydrodynamics, and when you solve them, then you will be able to solve the tasks of reliability and thermodynamics. But the sequence of task solving in methods of engineering is the result of the application of one or another design philosophy. If it is not so and we are just doing something, then very big troubles are possible. For example, the Russo-Japanese War. The cruiser Varyag ends up in Chemulpo Bay. Then a heroic battle and so on. Why did Varyag end up in Chemulpo Bay? Because the shipbuilding company, William Cramp & Sons, grossly violated the principles of designing steam cruisers' engines, and after a year of service, Varyag was in such a condition that it was not suitable for use as a cruiser. And since it was necessary to designate the presence of the Russian flag in Korea, Varyag was sent there in order to designate it. And in order not to violate its crumbling engine, another ship, the gunboat Koryets, was sent to help her. This is an example of the fact that there were some methods, but there was no design philosophy as such. Because if the philosophy of designing steam engines and ship designing had been correct, then Varyag would have been completely different. Either it would not have been in Chemulpo, or it single-handedly would have swept away the entire Japanese squadron. The main feature of European culture is that in it, science and religion exist separately, and art too. This is not the norm, because if you turn to history, then science, religion and art were inseparably merged, and all this was run by the Jretshood in every civilization. Moreover, it was inseparably merged to such an extent that Pythagoras, whose theorem we all learned, did not teach people if they did not know how to play at least some musical instrument. The reasons are simple. If a person does not know how to play, then the chain from feelings to motor skills is in some way not enclosed, and accordingly, there was no point in teaching him from his point of view. The next question is again related to philosophy. Hegel allegedly made 3 laws of dialectics. Well, if we turn to the encyclopedic dictionaries, then in the article Socrates, Socrates is characterized by the words, one of the founders of dialectics, as the art of cognition of the truth by posing leading questions. Look at 2 theses. The art of achieving truth by asking leading questions. The second thesis. Dialectics is a collection of certain laws. What is the difference? Art is always based on certain principles, but art is not formalizable. It cannot be algorithmized, because if, for example, you create a program, thanks to which the computer plays a certain melody, music, then art ends there where you make this program. And then comes pure algorithmics. This is no longer art. But if dialectics is an instrument of cognition, then 2 questions arise at once. First, every cognitive creative act is unique, because if it is not unique, then the principle of copy-paste works. Like in a computer. That is, you do something according to the prototype, and this is no longer a cognitive creative act where something new arises that has never existed before. And second, cognition is always subjective, i.e., there is a subject who cognizes. These 2 circumstances lead to the fact that the question arises. Hegel, proclaiming the laws of dialectics, did he create the basis for cognition or creativity, or block cognition and creativity, trying to subordinate them to the framework of these laws and the logics of their application? Let's look at Hegel's laws. The first one, the law of the unity and struggle of opposites. If one looks at history this way, then history was full of wars, when opposites fought to death, and the third party that governed the conflict as a whole did not participate in the conflict. The third party was not an opposite in this conflict, and it was not united with any of these opposites. That is, there are situations in life that do not fit into this law. The next law, the law of transformation of quantity into quality and vice versa. In chemistry there is such a phenomenon, isomerism. 2 substances with different chemical properties have the same atomic composition. That is, the quantity is present, it is identical, the quality should be identical, but the quality of the substances is different. Why? Because in the molecule of each of the substances, the atoms are in order differently, since the structure of the molecule is different, but the quality of the substance is also different. If you look in all languages, at least of highly civilized peoples, numbers are divided into cardinal and ordinal. But what happens if there is a mixture of cardinal and ordinal numbers? Well, tell children or adults the following statement for the refutation. A person has 11 fingers on his hands. There will be an objection immediately. How? 10. Well, let's count. The 10th, the 9th, the 8th, the 7th, the 6th, and on the other hand 5 fingers more, which is 11 altogether. Until the person understands that a forbidden operation was performed, and cardinal and ordinal numbers in one algorithm were mixed, as a result of which an incorrect answer was obtained, he cannot get out of this trap. It is the same with this second law of dialectics. Many phenomena do not fit into it, when the order is variable, but the number of participating elements is the same, their composition is the same. The next law, the law of negation. Here is an example. We have built a house, we negate the roof, the walls, and we get devastation. And the examples when textbooks offer some other interpretations of the law of negation, a seedling grows out of a grain, and so on, after all, are not the law of negation. This is a development and a cycle of development. It does not negate anything at all, but a transformation of what was in the previous stages into what will be in the next stages takes place. There may be specificities of the translation, there may be something else, but nonetheless, psychology and logics of man's psyche are such that the laws of dialectics, allegedly of Hegel, do not correspond to either the algorithmics of man's psyche or reality as such. And if they do not correspond but dominate over the process of cognition, then from the process of cognition some things are simply obliged to disappear and remain uncognizable, or the cognition will contain an error that will not always be admissible in practice. There is a mathematical joke. Any two numbers are approximately equal. In the aspect of approximate calculations, this joke is quite correct. But in the aspect of using the results of approximate calculations, the question arises: is this inaccuracy, that they are approximately equal, admissible or inadmissible in a particular case of activity? Therefore, one should agree with the definition of dialectics from the article Socrates. Dialectics is the art of cognition of the truth by posing leading questions. If we recognize this definition of dialectics as an instrument of cognition, then the first question arises: where do these questions come from that lead us to the truth? Why is one person able to formulate them and give an answer to them, meanwhile another person, even seemingly intellectually developed, is not yet able to formulate the same questions? And it turns out that Gnosiology, that is, the teaching about cognition, in the atheistic and religious world understandings, are mutually exclusive teachings. When I said that the peculiarity of European culture is precisely in the fact that science exists apart from religion, and philosophy is a part of science, then factually it turns out that regardless of whether certain philosophers were believers or they were convinced atheists, in this tradition, philosophy is one way or another atheistic. In the religious world understanding, Gnosiology, the teaching on cognition, carries a completely different character. Because in the atheistic world understanding, the primary question is: if there is no information in the psyche, then there is no personality, right? And from where and how does information in the psyche come? Is a person self-sufficient in selecting from the flow of everything perceived by the senses a signal that carries information, or is he not self-sufficient? Depending on how we answer this question, we get this or that theory of cognition. But in the European tradition, this question is not even posed. It is simply believed that an adult begins to cognize the world. Some cognize effectively, some ineffectively, some are geniuses, and some are stupid. And the prehistory of the question, why does one cognize and another one does not? What is it concluded in? There is a saying that when God wants to punish a person in a polytheistic variant, or when God wants to punish a person, this is the monotheistic variant, he deprives him of his reasoning. And if we turn to the scriptures of the Abrahamic religions, then in the New Testament, this comes down to the fact that the Holy Spirit is the guide into all truth. In the Old Testament, the Wisdom of Solomon chapter 1 also tells us that the Holy Spirit is the guide into all truth, carrier of all wisdom. But further there is an explanation that it will avoid sin and unreasonable speculations. That is, the Holy Spirit is a guide into all truth, but whether truth will be a guide for you or not depends on your raviousness. In the Quran, Surah 25 is called Al-Furqan in Arabic. The word Furqan is translated in two ways. The first variant is salvation. The second one is criterion, distinction. The two meanings supplement each other. Because if the lookouts on the Titanic had seen the iceberg in time, there would have been no disaster. But for various reasons, they did not see the silhouette of the iceberg in the dark. In most military operations, a defeat of an enemy does not begin with a shot. The defeat of an enemy begins with giving target coordinates. In order to give the coordinates, the object of the strike has to be distinguished from the background. If the target is not distinguished from the background, then the target coordinates are impossible. In the old days, what was the main method of firing torpedoes from a submarine at ships? The submarine stuck out the periscope for a few seconds, the commander looked through it, calculations of the torpedo triangle were made, and then they fired. There were no means for target coordinates in terms of hydroacoustics in the First World War. How did the potential victims react? The British had abstract artists who drew ships. Check the internet and see for yourselves how the artists drew schemes of civilian and military ships. And now look at this from the point of view of the commander of an enemy submarine. He sticks out the periscope for a few seconds, and instead of the usual silhouette of a ship, he sees who knows what. He fires a torpedo salvo, but the effectiveness of the torpedo attacks immediately drops by a significant number for the simple reason that at the initial stage of setting the target coordinates, an error was made. The object was poorly distinguished from the background. In the Quran, in this very surah, Al-Furqan, and in other surahs in the Quran, it is directly said that the Almighty gives a person distinction, the ability to distinguish unmediatedly, personally, addressedly. And this is conditioned by the nraviousness of a person. What is distinction? Imagine a situation. It is very, very dark. Nothing can be seen. And a ray of light illuminates something. How does the psyche perceive such a picture? It perceives it as a binary code. This, not this. A pair is formed. What comes next? Next is a simple question. Does a person's attention grasp this or not? It may grasp or it may not grasp this. It is like a circular view radar on a ship. Ships have an electronic system for scanning the situation. So something appears. What happens next? A corresponding signal is sent to the combat control center. Then the signal is processed, and if it is an enemy, then the signal is transmitted to the target combat tracking locator. You see, the laws of information processing, be it in technical systems or in biological systems, they are the same. If this catches the attention, then the question arises, what to do with it? Where should this and not this go next? And next is intellect. Moreover, intellect of the unconscious levels of the psyche. The power of the unconscious levels of the psyche is manifoldly greater than the power of the level of consciousness. What is next after intellectual processing? It is worldview. A worldview is a collection of images. A worldview is a model of the world. We need a model of the world in order to model the flow of events in life at a pace ahead of their real flow, many times ahead. And since modeling is variable, we can, on the basis of different variants, choose a preferable one for us in order to further work for its realization. In other words, depending on what kind of worldview you have formed in yourself, you are able or unable to model the flow of events in life. If you can model the flow of events in life adequately, then you can solve the task of stability of the object of governance in terms of predictability of behavior. I spoke about this in my lectures last semester. The basis for the solution of the task is worldview, but the worldview arises in the religious world understanding as a result of the sequence. Through the epiphany, distinction from God, or in the terms of the New Testament, the Holy Spirit is the guide into all truth. And further, that which is subjective of yours appears. That is, you are attentive to what is happening or not. If your attention misses something and this something is not memorized, then the worldview will consist of many such pairs of this, not this, which are in no way connected with each other. It is a kaleidoscope, it is not an image of the world. In a kaleidoscope there can be very interesting, beautiful patterns, like some separate fragments of knowledge, but it is impossible to use this for the prognosing of the flow of events. Let's say you have shaped your worldview, it is adequate, and you solve tasks of prognostics stably well. Shall I share with you how to do it? It should be said that there are two variants. Either you telepathically transmit a cartoon to someone, the cartoon that you drew in your inner world, or you express it in your own words, the way I am doing now. And the worldview, again through the intellect, transmits into what is called world understanding. Why? What is a concept? This is a certain interconnection between the image in your inner world and some lexical forms. If this is not the case, then mutual understanding among people is impossible, and many questions also become unsolvable, even for an individual. Because, look, for example, there are no corresponding images. I pronounce the Russian word luk, which means an onion and a bow. But in English this means to look. Which concept should one use? Depends on the context. What is a context? A context is a set of interconnections and the concept of the Russian word luk with other concepts. So it turns out that both worldview and world understanding can belong to two different types. There are two types of worldview. Variant 1 is a kaleidoscope. A kaleidoscope is characterized by the words, "The elderberries are in the garden, and the uncle is in Kiev. The next question, what is the name of the uncle? Vasil. Why Vasil? Because there is a Ukrainian proverb, Vasily is the wife's aunt. This is a kaleidoscope. Variant 2 is a mosaic. What is a mosaic? All kinds of puzzles that are sold in sets, a picture cut into pieces. This is not a mosaic. That is, this is the reverse process of mosaic. You should go to the Church of the Savior on Spilled Blood. Speaking in essence, the mosaic in this church is nothing. It is not a mosaic. Why? Because there are two technologies for making a mosaic. Variant 1. A wall, a ceiling, or another kind of surface is covered with cement, lime, or some other bonding material, and an artist presses the pieces of a mosaic in there, forming a certain pattern, image, or picture. Variant 2. Cardboard is taken, wood glue is applied to the cardboard after a sketch of the needed image is drawn on it in a mirror form. After that, the mosaic elements are glued to this cardboard, on wood glue, and a mirror image appears. Then this is taken to the place where the mosaic should be, into a wall with cement, lime, or some other bonding material. This cardboard is pressed and rolled. Well, when the bonding material is set, the cardboard and wood glue are washed off. The mosaics of the Church of the Savior on Spilled Blood were made using this technology, and there in some places you can even see where the cardboard panels were joined with one another, because at the junction there can be no elements that are simultaneously on both sides of the borders, and there is that straight line which separates one panel from another. So, what is characteristic of a mosaic? Suppose you look and see that some element of the mosaic consists of thousands of pieces, very different pieces of glass, pebbles, or something else, and you find that the detailization of this element is insufficient for the entirety of the picture. What to do? We take this fragment out of the mosaic and add the same image, only more detailed. With the mosaic, as with the worldview and world understanding, the situation is approximately the same. If you have an element, a fragment in the worldview mosaic, and you find that it is not detailed enough, then you can actually replace it with a more detailed, more developed one. There are two variants. Either you find the relevant knowledge and culture and fill them with it, or this whole chain repeats again, and the corresponding fragments of the mosaic shape in more detail, without disrupting the picture as a whole that has taken shape, or destroying it. The process of forming a mosaic can flow in two meeting directions. There is a well-known joke. It is believed that Ivan Papanin, at a station in the North Pole, when he was disassembling a rifle, was planted with a superfluous screw. And after that, he exhausted himself trying to assemble the rifle, because no matter what he did, there was always that superfluous screw left over. Why? Because in this case, the assembly sequence goes from the particular to the general. As a result, there was an assembled rifle with a superfluous screw. And if you go in the opposite order, from the general to the particular, there will be a specification according to which the rifle is disassembled into a certain number of parts, and in this specification, this screw is initially superfluous, which is immediately detected as superfluous and put aside. Therefore, the variant of assembling a worldview mosaic and a mosaic of world understanding is more reliable when it goes from the general to the particular, because if some particulars do not fit into the general, then there is something to think about. Why do they not fit? Either they are false and therefore do not fit, or some elements are missing, or some large-scale effects, they also have to be taken into account. So, in fact, the view of the whole, the image of the whole, it protects itself from distortions. But if you go in the reverse order, from the particular to the general, then anything can happen. In Soviet times, one of the toys for children's development was a construction set. A lot of screws and nuts, some metal panels and angles, something else, and they were full of holes. From all this, you can assemble what you want: a crane, a steam train, an airplane, a car. But it is you who are assembling. And before assembling, you must have this whole image in your head. And further on, it is only about questions of detailization. Because in principle, you can replace any element of the mosaic with a more detailed one. But if we go in the reverse order, anything can happen. So it turns out that mosaics, they are also divided into two classes. Mosaics which are assembled in the direction from general to particular, and mosaics which are assembled in the direction from particular to general. If this goes from the particular to the general, then what do we get in science? We get a lot of things. And what next? The next thing is that the principle practices the criterion of truth, either confirms or refutes. If we go from the general to the particular, then we obtain a stable picture of the world, into which it is rather difficult to cram nonsense. And if we go in the other order, then on the internet there are many of those who adhere to the version of a flat earth. They know a lot of particular facts, every one of which supposedly refutes the conception of the round earth, a globe that flies around the orbit, around the sun. The reason all these particular facts do not fit into the conception of the round earth is that there exists such an applied science, navigation. Here is the globe. Here is New York. Here is Lisbon. We are going to sail from New York to Lisbon by boat. There are two variants. We go along a constant course. This is called sailing along a loxodrome. A loxodrome is a curve that crosses all meridians at the same angle. Variant 2. We go along this arc of the Great Circle. The arc of the Great Circle is the shortest distance between points on the surface of the globe. The loxodrome and the orthodrome coincide in two cases. We go along the equator or along the meridian. In all other cases, the orthodrome, arc of the Great Circle, is shorter than the loxodrome. Therefore, all normal people sail and fly around the orthodrome for long distances, but for this the course has to be changed during the entire voyage or flight. There is no navigation based on the flat earth theory. However, the craziness is gaining momentum.